Thanks for watching us tonight. Let's get right to our top story. Is America more racially divided today than it was when President Obama took office?
Meanwhile, in Pflugerville, Texas, residents found a torn Quran covered in feces left in front of a local mosque.
I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that.
Do you think Islam is at war with the West?
I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there. There's a tremendous hatred. We have to get to the bottom of it.
Racial tension, a term that generates diverse emotions in different people, a term that divides communities, countries, and the world. The largest problem with racial tension is the overabundance of bias in the media outlets covering it. This bias comes from both sides of the conflict and makes finding good information almost impossible. This documentary seeks to address that issue with the hope of showing people how awful tension between races in this country is and what it causes. According to the University of Dayton, white privilege is a special advantage or benefit of white persons, with reference to divine dispensations, natural advantages, gifts of fortune, genetic endowments, and social relations.
In the community that we're in, to even discuss race or to even discuss structural inequality for certain groups of ethnicities, that topic is hard for people to even grasp because it's something that brings tension, it brings physiological distress to people because they feel like they're being attacked by the subject even being brought up.
I mean, I don't know if it's just human nature that cultures tend to hang out, because if I'm a new kid to a school, I'm going to gravitate towards the people that potentially look like me and act like me. I think that's probably reasonable, but then after you're there for a while, in theory, what you would like is that people would just kind of gravitate towards everyone, but I don't know that that's reality.
I mean, I'm African American, I'm Irish, I'm Native American. You know, there's probably 3 to 5 packs of those people that you'll see just around, and if you don't, you know, go and actually try to, you know, interact with those people, I mean.
I am aware that we have had experiences where students may have what is known as microaggressions, and maybe people questioning whether or not they should be within an academic environment or challenging their success.
I noticed that when I taught higher courses, I taught a senior AP literature course. Most of my students were white, there were a few minorities, and when I taught remedial courses, very often they were filled with minority students, African American, Puerto Rican, and it was, I don't know if it's a result of institutional racism, the larger social issues of poverty, but there was definite divisions.
Race is a social construct. In the United States, people's physical characteristics have been categorized into pseudo-scientific racial categories that assign biological significance with socio-political consequences. Embodied in the construction of race are group-based interests that perpetuate conflicts and social stratification. Historically, race has operated as a physical characteristic that affected people's welfare under uncertain circumstances. It also intensified their exposure to discrimination depending on their specific racial group.
Even with what we call the construction of race, and race being this socially constructed concept whereby people were categorized based on their physical characteristics, as if to say that there was something inherent about them that was different and connected to their race, and often that was characterized as being a negative inheritance.
The annual average victimization of blacks is 955,800. Moving from the celestial concept of trust to one that underscores human relationships, we must ask, in whom do we trust? In America, much of how we think about people also depends on their race. What is race?
We depict African Americans, particularly African American males, as thugs. so that dehumanizes them. Asian Americans are oftentimes depicted as foreigners, even though they may have been in the United States for multiple generations. Latinos tend to be depicted as irrational, right? And I think women, in particular white women, are depicted likewise as emotional, hysterical, etc. So I think that, you know, when we look at these depictions, they continue to persist because for many people they kind of strike a true chord.
For me, if I'm having a discussion with any, you know, professor, friend, random person on the street about, oh, what's your ethnicity? Or someone will say to me, oh, what are you? I sit there and say, I'm a human. And they look at me like that, like, oh, like, I mean, what are you though? You're like, you know what I'm asking? I'm like, no, you don't know what you're asking. Like, you're asking me, what am I? Like, I'm a brother, I'm a friend, I'm a student, you know, I'm an artist, I'm a painter.
They think about my religion like that because of the media and how the media controls. As for instance, when there was like a massacre or like a shooting, most of the time they never, like, just for example, the elementary school shooting, I remember they didn't say that person was a Christian or a Jew or a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever it is. They didn't use his religion, but the moment if a person is known to be a Middle Eastern or a foreigner of like the Eastern part, they would assume it's a Muslim, and if it is confirmed a Muslim, they would blast it all over the news saying Islam and Muslim and all of those stuff.
So, for instance, take the difference in depictions of the, quote, Arab Muslim world post 9/11 versus the Oklahoma City bombing, which wherein two white supremacists were responsible, right? So in the case of the 9/11 attacks, that's the emblematic of the entirety of the Muslim Arab world, whereas Timothy McVeigh and I believe it's Nichols, Michael, actually Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, that's who it is. They are just two individuals, right? Like, who are operating beyond the pale of society.
So lately, I think, especially after the attacks and everything in Paris, and then in Belgium and everything, I think Muslims in particular are really, really discriminated against, and I think they get such a bad reputation, and they take just the Muslim population in the U.S. in general takes the blame for the acts of like just a small sect of people, so it's quite unfair.
I mean, I still think there's discrimination in a lot of ways. Obviously, with what's been going on over the last few years in terms of racial tensions with black culture in police officers and some of that kind of stuff. But I still think if you had to say one, right now we're dealing with the terrorist stereotype in Middle Eastern.
Prior to the 9/11 attacks, the program typically recorded between 20 and 30 anti-Muslim hate crimes per year. But in 2001, that number rose to more than tenfold to nearly 500. In the years since, annual hate crimes against Muslims have consistently hovered in the 100 to 150 range, roughly 5 times higher than pre-9/11 rates. As UNC professor Charles Kurzman and Duke professor David Schanzer explained last June in the New York Times, Islam-inspired terror attacks accounted for 50 fatalities over the past 13 and a half years. Meanwhile, right-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks per year in the decade after 9/11, causing a total of 254 fatalities. If we examine cases of purported ethnic conflict, we generally find that it involves more than one ancient hatred. Even the hatreds we find are relatively recent, and constructed by those ethnic entrepreneurs taking political advantage of situations rooted in colonial domination and fed by neo-colonial exploitation.
I think they oversimplify everything, and I think that's dangerous. When you start to oversimplify things, they're very complicated. People think they understand, and we don't understand. How am I supposed to understand someone who grew up in a totally different way from me? It's okay. I need to get to know them to understand them. So for me to try to think I know what they're going through and that it's more or less relevant than what I'm doing is stupid. So I think when the media oversimplifies things, it's dangerous.
Well, as far as racial groups and whether or not we see that there are what we call non-whites versus whites experiencing discrimination, historically that discrimination has occurred with respect to non-white groups as they were constructed as non-white.
There's always certain media outlets that kind of perpetuate certain stereotypes, whether it's against blacks or Latinos or even against like Indian people. I think, just speaking for myself personally, I kind of have, you know, in the past maybe from certain groups of people gotten pushed into like that stereotype of always being like smart and being, you know, very against kind of assimilating to the population or something like that. And then as far as other racial groups, I think that everyone kind of gets stereotyped, whether it's like, you know, black people being like really great athletes or Latinos being something like this or illegal immigrants.
Like, just look, they're building a residential hall for African American students. Like, if that's something that needs to be done, then what's the stigma of those people being represented in this community? It's supposed to be an academic community. It's supposed to represent the demographics, and I don't feel like this campus really does that.
Oh, I think that's huge. And I think that's also a result of, unfortunately, isolated communities. If people in Mansfield, if their only experience with large groups of African Americans is what they see on TV, they're going to have a different perception than if they are living in a different community. And that's unfortunate, and that's systemic. So the reverse, I would have, at East Hartford, I had students who had no idea about other communities besides their own because they had also been isolated. And very often, many students would struggle when they left urban centers to go off to college because they felt uncomfortable with different groups of people. And there were other problems that would occur, but that's also a problem. Yeah. I also know of people who are in what we would call, I guess, multiracial relationships and purposely have to choose a community where their children will not be isolated. And also where their children will not feel that there's any difference.
First of all, we could just look at Hurricane Katrina. If you live in a certain area where your demographics are being represented in a certain way, I mean, you're just point blank not getting the resources that you deserve. I mean, you're not going to be given opportunities that are for you. Literally, I know somebody that's from New Jersey. Hurricane Sandy came through. People were shooting each other for gas. I mean, that's a normal thing, but when they as in the state, they as in authorities, specifically do not attend to those places, I mean, like, you're being left to your own demise, and your demise is being caused by the lack of attention.
The media neglects to acknowledge statistics that show the contrast between whites to blacks. In 2010, close to 28% of blacks were in poverty, compared with only 10% of whites. While 45.8% of black children live in poverty, as opposed to only 9.9% of white children.
Because the way that we talk about whiteness in the United States is monolithic, meaning that, you know, there's just whiteness and then there's difference associated with like kind of Asianness, blackness, etc. But whiteness is a category of power. And what about people who don't have power?
As of 2016, I would definitely have to say African Americans, the fact that they've been outlandishly targeted by law enforcement. Honestly, I would sit back and say that any non-Anglo-Saxon descent group is pretty much at the mercy of the state. Pretty much, if you aren't able to prove certain things, then you will be discriminated against because of stereotype.
And it's the same thing for white people as well. I think that they always get, you know, really, really bad reputations as someone who's like a racist or someone who's closed-minded.
2,207 per 100,000 blacks are incarcerated, compared to only 380 per 100,000 for whites. In the federal justice system, blacks are 20 times more likely to be sentenced to life without parole for nonviolent crimes than whites. A study conducted at the University of Pennsylvania Law School showed that blacks are 30% more likely to be imprisoned than whites for the same crime. We approach all individuals with equality. No matter what size, race, or gender, we assess the individual as the individual that they are. A person's demeanor plays a very important role in how their interaction with the police is going to go. Police are walking into a situation that, for whatever reason, those people involved can't handle. We know that tempers and emotions are usually high and at times can be sporadic. A good officer will be able to distinguish between someone who may just need to blow off some steam and vent versus someone who may be an actual threat. With regard to men in turbans or women wearing hijabs, I have never seen any officers treat them any differently than anyone else. In Meriden, we have numerous establishments owned and operated by persons from Middle Eastern countries, and relationships have all been positive. I believe that the media is highly responsible for driving a wedge between law enforcement and the community. There are definitely bad officers out there, just as there are bad teachers, clergymen, and doctors. The media takes a small percentage of incidents and floods the airways, so all people see when they turn on televisions is police corruption and police brutality. Very rarely do you see officers handing out basketballs at neighborhood courts, the toy drives in the winter, or the numerous calls every day where the police were called to investigate a crime, make a determination that there was not a crime, and left without someone getting tasered, beaten up, or pepper sprayed. We don't see those stories because they are boring and nobody will care about them.
I don't think racism will end because there's no reason for it to end, because people will always be different. Absolutely not. Racism will not come to an end because the simple fact that people are different, the simple fact that we have groups that identify together, it's sectionalism. We live in an area, we live in a time that we're becoming less ignorant to these things, but just because we have all this activism, just because we have knowledge getting out there like this video, there's people that will see this video, there's people that won't see this video. Both of those scenarios can or cannot change someone's idea, but it's negligence, If someone doesn't sit there and realize what they're doing, you can't fault them for not understanding the world that they're creating, but you can fault someone for having that knowledge and not using it.
And I think that there's not one type of one big end where there's going to be no racism, I think, or classism or any type of ism. I think that's always going to be existent to some degree. I just think that it is going to get less and less as time goes on, and I think we've seen in the past, even in the past 60, 70 years since our grandparents to right now, there's a lot of people who went through the civil rights movement all the way to now who probably couldn't imagine the country as it is right now back then. So I think it's on a decline, and it's on a really sharp decline. I just don't think that it'll ever go away completely, and I don't think we should ever expect racism, classism, or just discrimination in general, any type of discrimination, to go away completely.
Honestly, I don't know. The correct answer is probably say yes, but I don't think it's going to happen while I'm alive. And I'm not, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we see each other as having differences. So that's never going to go away because I think that that's the way of the world. But to hate someone or actually have negative opinions about someone based on something stupid like the way that they look, I would love to say it's going to go away, but I haven't seen any rhetoric politically or otherwise that leads me to believe that's going to change anytime soon.
The principal the year before had taken down Malcolm X posters. Someone put a Malcolm X poster up because the movie came out. And I didn't, I thought that was kind of weird, but I started teaching, and I was teaching speeches, so I handed out a speech from Bill Clinton, a speech from George Bush, the first one, and a speech from Jesse Jackson. They were all running for president. And when I handed out the Jesse Jackson one, a student who was African American raised his hand and said to me, "Miss, are you black?" Because no one ever handed him, I'm assuming, something written by a black person. And so, when was that, 1993? That was a little shocking to me.